It was a quiet night at St. Gregory's Hospital, or at least it seemed quiet. The halls were dimly lit, the only sound coming from the low hum of fluorescent lights. The night shift workers had grown accustomed to the stillness, their routine punctuated by the soft clicking of their shoes against the linoleum floor and the occasional distant echo of a door closing. But Dr. Thomas wasn't accustomed to the unsettling feeling that now lingered in the air. He had been a doctor for years, and his mind was always grounded in logic, but tonight felt different. He'd made his rounds earlier, checked on the critical patients, and signed off on any urgent cases. But when he arrived at room 312, something was off. The patient, Mr. Clark, had been admitted after a car accident. His injuries were severe but not life-threatening. A simple case, at least, that's what Dr. Thomas had thought. Yet when he opened the door to the room, his stomach dropped. The bed was empty. The sheets were neatly pulled back, as if the patient had gotten up and left the room. But the monitors, they were still running, tracking Mr. Clark's vitals as if he were still lying there. The steady beat of his heart rate echoed in the room, strangely soothing and ominous at once. Dr. Thomas checked the rest of the room in a panic, his eyes darting across every corner. No signs of a struggle, no indications that anyone had tried to escape or was hiding. The door was locked from the inside, and the window was sealed tight. How could Mr. Clark have disappeared? Frantically, he stepped into the hallway and called out to the nurses. "Has anyone seen Mr. Clark? Room 312 is empty." But the hall was silent. No one answered. The feeling in the air was growing heavier, more oppressive. A chill seemed to settle into the bones of the building, a coldness that didn't belong. Dr. Thomas continued down the corridor, his footsteps echoing through the long, sterile hallway. As he approached the elevator, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, a figure, standing motionless in the shadowed corner. It was Mr. Clark, or at least it looked like him. The man stood with his back to Dr. Thomas, his body unnaturally still, his posture wrong, as though he were waiting for something or someone. "Mr. Clark?" Dr. Thomas called out, his voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. Dr. Thomas approached cautiously, his heartbeat pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. The skin of Mr. Clark's face was pale, drained of color, and his eyes were wide open, but lifeless, blank. His body was rigid, like a statue. "Mr. Clark, are you all right?" Dr. Thomas asked again, though the answer was already obvious. He reached out, placing a hand on the patient's shoulder, and that's when it happened. Without warning, Mr. Clark's head jerked back too far too fast. His neck twisted in an unnatural angle, and his eyes locked onto Dr. Thomas. But these weren't the eyes of the man he had treated hours before. These eyes were darker, colder, and filled with a malevolent force that sent a shiver down his spine. The figure opened its mouth, but it wasn't the voice of Mr. Clark that came out. "Help me." The voice was a low, guttural rasp, something that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. Dr. Thomas recoiled in horror, stumbling back as the figure slowly moved toward him. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. His legs felt like lead as he tried to run, but the figure followed, its movement jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. As he reached the door, Dr. Thomas looked back, his breath ragged, his pulse racing. The figure had stopped just at the threshold. It was staring at him now, silent, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Why won't you leave?" Dr. Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. But the figure didn't answer. It just stood there, watching him, as the door slowly swung shut. Dr. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, irreparably wrong with that room, as if Mr. Clark's body had never truly left. But neither had his spirit. Was Mr. Clark still alive? Was that even him anymore? Or had something beyond explanation, taken his place? The answer remains hidden, locked away behind the cold, sterile walls of St. Gregory's Hospital. And the question is, how many more stories like this are buried beneath those same walls, waiting to be uncovered? St. Gregory's Hospital had always been a place of healing, or at least that's what the world saw it as. But for those who worked the night shift, the hospital became something else, a place where the air felt too heavy, the silence too thick, a place where something wasn't right. Nurse Laura had worked at St. Gregory's for over 15 years, yet there was one night she would never forget. It was a night that changed everything she thought she knew about life, death, and what lies between. It was the night Emily died, or at least that's what they thought. Emily was just 25, a young woman who came in for a routine procedure. The surgery had gone smoothly, or so the doctor said, but no one expected what happened next. Later that evening, Emily went into sudden cardiac arrest. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, the monitor flatlined and the heart stopped beating. The room fell silent. The doctors exchanged knowing glances, their faces grim. Emily was dead. There was no doubt. Nurse Laura stood by, watching as Emily's lifeless body was covered with a sheet. She'd seen it all before. Dead patients were nothing new in her line of work. But something about Emily's death was different. Something lingered in the air, an unsettling sensation that couldn't be ignored. As the night dragged on, the hospital returned to its usual rhythm, until Nurse Laura received a call she wasn't expecting. "Room 211. The family's here to see Emily," said the voice on the other end of the line. Emily's family had already been told of her death. So why were they back? Confused, Nurse Laura walked to room 211, the room where Emily had been declared dead only hours earlier. The hall was eerily quiet, the lights dim. As she approached the door, something felt off, too quiet, too still. She entered the room, and her heart skipped a beat. The bed was empty. The sheets, once neatly arranged, were now disheveled, as if someone had gotten up. There was no sign of Emily, no sign of anyone. Yet the monitors were still running. Her eyes went to the screens and she froze. Emily's vitals were still being tracked. The heart rate was steady, the breathing consistent. But how could that be? Emily was dead. There was no way her body could still be functioning. Nurse Laura stepped into the room, her mind racing. She checked the bathroom, the closet, and the bed again, as if searching for some explanation. But there was none. The room was silent, unnaturally so. That's when she heard it. A faint sound, like a breath. A slow, deliberate inhale. She turned, her heart now pounding in her chest. And there she was, Emily, standing by the window, facing away from her, completely still. The girl who had been pronounced dead just hours ago, the girl who should have been lying cold in a morgue somewhere, was now standing in front of her, alive, yet not alive. Nurse Laura called out cautiously, "Emily?" No answer. She stepped closer, each step making the air feel colder, heavier. As she approached, Emily slowly turned around. But it wasn't Emily's face she saw. It was something else, something hollow. Her eyes were wide, almost vacant, with dark circles under them, as if she hadn't slept in years. Her skin was unnaturally pale, more ghostly than human, and her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, in a voice that wasn't Emily's, but something else, something cold and distant, came the words that would haunt Nurse Laura forever. "It's not my time yet." The words hung in the air, chilling the room. Emily's body swayed slightly, but her gaze never left Nurse Laura. It was as though she wasn't seeing her at all, but staring through her into a place no one could reach. Nurse Laura's throat went dry. Her legs froze. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't move. Emily was dead. She had to be dead. But here she was, standing, breathing, but not alive. Emily's head tilted, as if studying Nurse Laura from a distance. And then the air in the room turned cold, almost unbearably so. The lights above flickered, casting long, haunting shadows across the walls. "Help me," Emily whispered, the sound barely audible. "I can't leave." The words hit like a physical blow. Nurse Laura took a step back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She needed to get out of the room. She needed to get away. But when she turned toward the door, the room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, blocking her escape. The whispers grew louder, now not just from Emily, but from the walls, the shadows, whispers that were growing more desperate. Nurse Laura pushed the door open with all her strength, and as she stepped into the hallway, she thought she was safe. But then she heard it, soft, faint, but unmistakable. "Laura," she turned, but no one was there. The hospital was silent again, as though nothing had ever happened. But Nurse Laura couldn't shake the feeling that Emily had never truly left that room, and something dark, something malevolent, had taken her place. What happened to Emily? Was she truly dead? Or had something taken her spirit, her soul, long before the doctors even realized? Why did she return? Was it a mistake, or was she forever trapped in that room, unable to escape? The hospital may have closed its doors on her story, but Nurse Laura knows the truth. Something remains in room 211, and whatever it is, it's still waiting. Some nights, St. Gregory's Hospital seemed alive in ways no one could explain. The walls whispered with secrets. The floors creaked with stories that had never been told. And for Dr. Michael West, the night shift had always been a lonely affair, until one night, when the hospital decided to reveal its darkest secret. Drive West was new to St. Gregory's, having just joined the team a few months ago. He had heard the rumors about the hospital, whispers of strange happenings, odd occurrences in the dead of night, but he had dismissed them all. He was a man of science, after all. Everything had a logical explanation, or so he thought. That particular night, Drive West was assigned to the ICU, a place that had earned its reputation for being one of the quietest areas of the hospital. But as he walked through the long, dimly lit halls, a strange feeling crept over him. It was the sort of feeling that gnawed at the back of your mind, urging you to turn around, to check behind you. But when he reached the ICU, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The monitors beeped rhythmically. Patients slept in their beds, and the only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning. He went about his rounds, checking on each patient, making sure everything was in order, until he reached room 409. It was a small room, tucked away in the far corner of the ICU, where the most critical patients were placed. The patient in room 409, a man named William, had been in a coma for nearly 6 months after a horrific car crash. Doctors had all but given up on him, but his family still clung to hope, visiting him every day. Drive Wes had checked on him earlier in the night, and everything seemed normal. But now, as he approached the room again, he noticed something was off. The door was slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been. All patient rooms were supposed to remain closed unless a nurse or doctor was inside. Drive West hesitated, his hand resting on the doorframe. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the faint light coming from the hallway. The only sound was the soft, steady beep of William's heart monitor. But as Drive West looked at the bed, his blood ran cold. William wasn't in it. The sheets were perfectly undisturbed, as if no one had been lying there at all. Drive West checked the floor, the bathroom, the closet, nothing. No sign of the patient. It was as if William had vanished into thin air. Panic gripped his chest. He rushed to the monitor and stared in disbelief. The readings were still normal, as though William was still there, still alive. But the bed was empty. He turned around quickly, his heart pounding, and that's when he saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. Drive West's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, draped in a long, dark coat. The face was obscured, hidden in shadows. But there was something eerily familiar about the shape. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Who's there?" Drive West called out, his voice shaky. No answer. He took a cautious step forward, his hand reaching for the light switch. As he flicked it on, the figure vanished. Gone, as if it had never been there at all. His heart raced as he scanned the room again. There was no one. The door was still ajar, the bed still empty. But the air was different. It felt colder now, heavier, as if something or someone was still present. He quickly checked the hallway, but it was empty. No one had passed by. No one could have entered the room without him noticing. Drive West's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a trick of the light? Was he imagining things? But the feeling in the room, he couldn't shake it. It was as though the presence, the figure, was real, and it was still watching him. He hurried to check the patient log for room 409. His eyes scanned the page, searching for any explanation. But then, something caught his eye, a note written in a hurried, trembling hand. Patient William hasn't moved in months. His family hasn't visited since the accident. He died last week. Drive West froze. The note wasn't signed by any staff member, nor did it match any other handwriting in the hospital. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere, added to the log without anyone noticing. What did it mean? Had William really died? Was the figure he saw in the corner his ghost, lingering in the room where his body should have been? As Drive West walked out of room 409, the lights flickered above him. For a brief moment, everything went dark, and then, as if nothing had happened, the lights returned. But he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The hospital held secrets, and some of those secrets were far darker than he had ever imagined. What did drive West really see that night? Was it the ghost of a patient who had never left? Or was something more sinister at work within the walls of St. Gregory's Hospital? How many other secrets does this place keep hidden, waiting for someone to uncover them? One thing is for sure. Whatever happens in St. Gregory's, it doesn't stay hidden for long. Every night at St. Gregory's Hospital, the silence felt like a living, breathing thing. It crept through the halls, seeping into every room, every crack in the walls. It was a silence that was so thick, you could feel it pressing against your chest. But not all silences are peaceful, and not all are empty. For Nurse Emma, it was just another quiet shift. She had worked the graveyard hours for years, and while she had heard rumors about strange happenings, whispers in the break room, strange voices in empty halls, she always dismissed them. After all, the human mind can only take so much. Exhaustion, stress, and the darkness of night could make even the most rational minds conjure strange ideas. That night, however, was different. She had no way of knowing that it would be the night she would face something far beyond the limits of her understanding. It started with the patient in room 605, an elderly man named Mr. Harper. He had been diagnosed with advanced heart failure and was nearing the end of his life. His family had already said their goodbyes, and he had been moved to palliative care to spend his final days in peace. But something wasn't quite right about Mr. Harper. He had been unusually calm for the past few days. Unusually calm for someone who knew his time was running out. He had stopped asking about his family. His voice had become faint, and his eyes, they seemed distant, as though he were staring at something far beyond the walls of his room. Nurse Emma had been attending to him that night, adjusting his forward drip, checking his vitals. Everything appeared normal, almost too normal. His breathing was steady. His heart rate was consistent. But as she reached for his chart, a strange feeling washed over her, one she couldn't explain. She glanced up at Mr. Harper, who had been lying motionless for hours, his eyes half closed. But now, his eyes were wide open, staring directly at her. Frozen in place, Nurse Emma swallowed hard. There was something unnerving about the way he was looking at her, something knowing. She approached his bed slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mr. Harper?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is everything okay?" He didn't respond. His gaze never wavered from her, but his lips barely moved. A faint whisper escaped his throat, so quiet that she had to lean in to hear. "It's too late." The word sent a chill down Nurse Emma's spine. She leaned in closer, trying to understand what he meant. But as she did, the room seemed to grow colder, and the faint hum of the monitors started to flicker. "Mr. Harper, are you in pain?" she asked, her voice now barely audible. His eyes flickered for a moment, then he closed them. The beeping of the monitor suddenly stopped. The room grew even colder. Nurse Emma's breath caught in her throat as she checked the heart monitor. The screen was blank, completely still. She quickly checked his pulse, but there was none. Mr. Harper had flatlined. He was gone. But then something happened. The lights above flickered, and the room grew even darker. Nurse Emma looked around the room, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. A strange noise echoed from the corner of the room, soft at first, like a whisper, but then growing louder, more insistent. "Help me!" Nurse Emma turned sharply. There, in the corner of the room, was a shadow moving against the wall. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was something solid, something real, but it was wrong. The shadow moved as though it had a life of its own, stretching and contorting in impossible shapes. Her pulse raced, her hands trembling as she backed away from the bed, her eyes never leaving the dark corner. "Help me!" The voice whispered again, this time coming from Mr. Harper. But Mr. Harper wasn't speaking. His mouth was shut tight. The voice wasn't coming from him. It was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere near him, as if another presence had taken hold of his body. Nurse Emma turned to flee, but the door slammed shut in front of her with a deafening bang. The room seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with a sense of dread that was impossible to escape. The whispering grew louder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift and move closer to her. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she tried to find the strength to move, to scream, to do something. But she couldn't. In the corner, the shadow continued to grow, stretching and shifting. And then, out of the darkness, a figure slowly emerged, a tall, skeletal figure, its face hidden in shadows. "Help me," it whispered once more, its voice hollow and cold. Nurse Emma stood frozen, unable to move, as the figure reached out toward her, its hand cold as ice. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room fell silent. The door creaked open on its own, and Nurse Emma bolted from the room, her breath ragged. She ran down the hall, heart racing, not stopping until she reached the nurse's station. When she told her colleagues what happened, they just stared at her in disbelief. But Nurse Emma knew what she had seen. She had seen something beyond explanation, something that no one was meant to see. What was the figure that visited Mr. Harper's room that night? Was it the spirit of the man himself, or was it something else? Something that had been waiting in the dark corners of St. Gregory's Hospital for a very long time? Nurse Emma couldn't answer that, but she could never forget the feeling. The cold hand that reached out to her, the whispering voice that followed her even as she ran. And the question remains, what else is waiting in the shadows of St. Gregory's? What other secrets is the hospital hiding, waiting to be uncovered? St. Gregory's Hospital was, by all appearances, just like any other hospital. But there were areas that no one talked about, places that were seldom used and never mentioned in casual conversation. One of those places was the East Wing, the oldest part of the hospital. The East Wing was known for being different. Nurses and doctors didn't like to go there alone. And at night, the lights in the hallway often flickered and dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. For Nurse David, working the night shift in that part of the hospital was a job he had always dreaded. He had been working at St. Gregory's for years, but he had always avoided the East Wing unless absolutely necessary. He knew the stories, the whispers of strange occurrences, of people hearing footsteps when no one was around, of patients who reported seeing things that couldn't be explained. But tonight, it was his turn. He was scheduled to do a routine check on the rooms in the East Wing, making sure everything was in order for the night. David entered the East Wing reluctantly, the hallway stretching out in front of him like a dark tunnel. The walls were old, the paint peeling, and the air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something metallic like blood. He quickly glanced at the directory on the wall, checking the numbers of the rooms he needed to visit. As he made his way down the hall, the silence around him felt oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides. His footsteps echoed too loudly, too sharply against the empty walls. He reached room 705 and stepped inside. The patient in the room, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harris, was asleep, her breathing steady and calm. Nothing seemed unusual, yet the feeling in the room was wrong. The air felt too still, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. David finished his check and turned to leave, but as he did, the lights above flickered. They dimmed, then flickered again, casting strange shadows across the room. The hallway outside seemed to stretch on, impossibly long, as if it were growing darker. He froze. The hallway seemed different. The walls were no longer lined with rooms. The doors that should have been there were gone, replaced by blackness. The floor felt like it was moving beneath his feet, as though the hallway was shifting, elongating. David's heart began to race as he turned back to the hallway. The once familiar path was now unfamiliar, stretching endlessly in both directions. No rooms, no exits, just an infinite corridor of darkness. His pulse quickened. He tried to go back to the nurse's station, but the hallway wouldn't let him. He walked, but the distance didn't change. The doors kept disappearing. The walls kept shifting. Then something caught his eye. At the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of the darkness, he saw a figure, a silhouette, standing perfectly still. Its features were indistinguishable, shrouded in shadow, but David could feel its presence. The air around it was cold, unnatural. He couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed, as though the very air around him had turned to stone. "Hello." David's voice cracked, barely audible. The figure didn't respond, but it started to move toward him, slowly, deliberately, as if it was walking through the very air itself, unaffected by the gravity of the hospital. David stepped back, heart hammering in his chest. The corridor seemed to stretch farther and farther as the figure came closer. The lights flickered again, and suddenly, the hallway was completely dark. He could no longer see the figure, but he could feel it. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the lights returned, and the hallway was exactly as it had been before. The doors were back. The corridor was normal, but David knew something had changed. He turned to leave, but when he glanced over his shoulder, he saw something else. A door that hadn't been there a moment ago. Room 711. It wasn't on the directory. It wasn't part of the building he had seen just moments before. But there it was, right in front of him. With trembling hands, David reached for the door handle. The cold metal sent a shock through his fingers, and when he pushed the door open, the smell hit him first, damp, musty, like an old tomb. Inside, the room was dark, and the air was thick with dust. But it wasn't empty. No. There was a bed. A figure lay in it, motionless, covered in a thin sheet. David couldn't see the face, but he didn't need to. He could feel it, the unmistakable, suffocating weight of death in the room. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. And then the figure moved, slowly, with a terrible, jerking motion. The figure turned its head to look at him. But the face, there was no face. Just darkness. An empty void where eyes should have been. David's breath caught in his throat. His body screamed for him to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. His mind was consumed with an overpowering sense of dread. The figure sat up. "Welcome," it whispered, its voice hollow and strange. David took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The room was closing in around him. The shadows stretched, pulled toward him like the grip of an unseen hand. "Who are you?" David finally managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to rise from the bed, moving toward him in slow, deliberate steps. What was the figure in room 711? Where did it come from, and why had David been led to it? Was the east wing of St. Gregory's Hospital simply a forgotten part of the building, or was it hiding something far darker, something that had been waiting for the right person to uncover it? David's story may have ended that night, but the question remains. Who or what was waiting for him in that endless hallway? As the night deepened at St. Gregory's Hospital, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. The air felt thick, as though something was moving just out of sight. The hospital's older sections, with their peeling walls and flickering lights, held more than just memories. They held secrets. For Dr. Catherine Miller, the night shift had become a routine. She had worked at St. Gregory's for over 10 years and had seen everything the hospital had to offer, or so she thought. But tonight, something was different. It started with a simple thing, an unexpected sound. Dr. Miller had just finished checking on the patients in the ICU and was heading down the main hallway when she heard it. Footsteps. At first, she thought it was just another nurse on the late shift, but as she turned the corner, the hall was empty. No one was there. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, like someone walking just behind her, but when she turned, the hallway was as empty as before. Her heart rate quickened, but she tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the echoes of her own movements. She pressed on, but the footsteps followed, always just a few steps behind her. "Hello," Dr. Miller called out, her voice echoing down the long, empty hall. No answer. The footsteps continued, now louder, closer. Her pulse raced. She quickened her pace. But no matter how fast she walked, the footsteps kept in perfect rhythm with her own. She reached for her phone, fingers trembling, and dialed the nurse's station. "Hello? This is Dr. Miller in the main hall. Is anyone there?" she asked, her voice edged with panic. No response. The line was dead. She froze. The footsteps had stopped, but then they started again. Only now, they were coming from the direction she had just walked back down the hall. The sound of heavy boots scraping against the floor. But no one was there. Dr. Miller's breath hitched in her chest. She turned and ran, but the footsteps were right behind her now, growing louder as though something or someone was closing in on her. She reached the end of the hallway, but there was no exit. The door was locked. She turned around quickly, her hand on the handle. But when she looked back down the hall, a figure was standing at the far end, silhouetted in the dim light. It wasn't just any figure. It was her own reflection, standing perfectly still, staring at her. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the figure wasn't just a reflection. It was moving, coming toward her. Her legs felt heavy, unwilling to move. She stood frozen, her eyes locked on the approaching figure. The footsteps grew louder and louder, now deafening in the confined space. The figure came closer, and with each step, Dr. Miller could feel the air growing colder, the temperature in the hallway plummeting. Suddenly, the figure stopped. It stood just in front of her, its face hidden in shadow. But she knew it wasn't her. It was something else, something dark. Dr. Miller opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her body refused to obey. The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, and touched her arm. The touch burned through her skin, as though it was searing her from the inside out. She gasped, her vision fading as the world around her began to warp and twist. And then, in a single, horrible moment, everything went black. What was the figure that stalked Dr. Miller down the hall that night? Was it a ghost, a reflection of something darker, or was it something even more sinister? Was the hospital truly just a place of healing, or was it hiding something far more terrifying within its walls? Dr. Miller may never know, but one thing is certain. There are things in the shadows of St. Gregory's that no one can escape. In the darkest corner of St. Gregory's Hospital lies the Silent Ward. Few remember it exists and fewer still ever talk about it. But those who work there, those who have seen its depths, know better than to question its mysteries. For Nurse Lucy, the Silent Ward was both a curiosity and a fear. She had heard the stories, the whispers about strange occurrences, about rooms that seemed to shift on their own, and the patients who were never quite right. But she had never experienced it for herself, at least not until that night. It was nearing the end of her shift when Nurse Lucy was asked to check on a patient who had been moved to the Silent Ward. The patient, Mr. Stevens, had been in a coma for months after a car accident. There had been no sign of improvement, no change in his condition, but the doctors had decided to move him to this secluded part of the hospital. They said it was for quiet monitoring, but something about the place didn't sit right with Lucy. She had been to the Silent Ward only once before, during her first week at St. Gregory's, and the memory still haunted her. The oppressive stillness of the place. The way the halls seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into shadows. The way the air felt thick, as though the walls themselves were suffocating. She stepped into the elevator, her heart pounding as it descended to the lower floors. As the doors closed, she heard something, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. She turned, but no one was there. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it. Exhaustion, she told herself. The long hours were starting to play tricks on her mind. But as she stepped out of the elevator, the air grew colder, the silence even more intense. The walls were narrow, the lights dim, flickering like they might go out at any moment. The hallway seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. She walked down it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Each step felt heavier, as if something was pulling at her, holding her back. She reached room 812, where Mr. Stevens had been placed. The door creaked open as she stepped inside. The room was dark, save for a small light above the bed, casting long shadows across the floor. Mr. Stevens lay motionless, his eyes closed, his body still as a statue. But there was something wrong about the way he lay there, something that made Lucy's skin crawl. She checked his vitals. Everything was normal. His pulse was steady, his heart rate stable. But the longer she watched him, the more she felt it, the feeling that someone was watching her. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone in the doorway, but the room was empty. The feeling only intensified. Then she heard it again, a whisper, soft, faint, but clear as day. "Help me." Lucy's breath caught in her throat. The whisper seemed to come from Mr. Stevens, though his lips hadn't moved. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mr. Stevens?" She whispered, "Can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, silent. Then Mr. Stevens' fingers twitched. His hand moved ever so slightly, just a fraction, but enough to make Lucy jump back. She watched in horror as his eyes fluttered open, but they weren't his eyes. Not entirely. His pupils were black, completely black, like the darkest of voids. His gaze fixed on her unblinking, as though he were seeing through her, not at her. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't from him. It was from all around her, voices, hundreds of them, murmuring in the shadows, filling the room with a cacophony of pleading, desperate cries. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" Lucy's blood ran cold as she backed away from the bed, her legs trembling. The air around her grew heavier, colder. She tried to call for help, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Suddenly, the lights above her flickered and went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, surrounding her from all sides. She could feel them closing in, the voices echoing in her mind, in her ears, as if they were coming from the very walls. And then, out of the darkness, she heard something even worse, a low, guttural growl. It came from the bed. Lucy turned toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. Mr. Stevens was no longer lying motionless. He was sitting up, his body jerking unnaturally, as if he was being controlled by something else. His mouth opened, but it wasn't a voice that came from it. It was a scream that pierced through the silence of the room, echoing through the walls and rattling her bones. "Help me," he whispered again, but it wasn't him anymore. The voice was different, dark, distorted, like something trying to break free. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows swirling, the whispers turning into screams. Lucy couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't escape. Just as she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, the lights flickered back on. Mr. Stevens was still in his bed, his eyes closed, his body still. But the room was different. The air was thick with an unsettling presence, as though something had just been unleashed. Lucy didn't wait another second. She ran out of the room, down the hallway, her heart racing as the voices seemed to follow her. As she reached the elevator, the doors opened, but the hallway was different. The walls seemed to stretch farther, the shadows darker, the whispers louder. She pressed a button for the main floor, but the doors didn't close. The reflection of the hallway was now visible in the elevator doors, but it wasn't the hallway she had just walked through. It was the silent ward, stretching infinitely, its darkness consuming everything in its path. What had Lucy encountered in that room? Was it truly Mr. Stevens, or something else that had taken hold of him? What was the silent ward hiding, and why did it pull her into its grip? There are many secrets in St. Gregory's Hospital, but the silent ward might be the darkest of them all. What waits in the shadows, behind closed doors, may never be fully understood. And the question remains, what happens to those who enter the silent ward and never come back the same? Nurse Lucy never spoke of what happened in the silent ward. No one ever asked. The hospital continued its routine day after day, as though nothing unusual had ever happened. But Lucy couldn't shake what she had seen, or what had seen her. In the weeks that followed, she couldn't escape the feeling that the ward, that room, was still calling to her. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she saw the black void of Mr. Stevens' eyes staring back at her, that desperate whisper still echoing in her mind. Help me, help me. And it wasn't just the memories of that night that haunted her. It was the whispers that followed her wherever she went, in every room, in every empty hallway. No matter where she went in St. Gregory's, it felt as though the walls were whispering her name. The shadows were watching her. One evening, after her shift ended, Lucy found herself standing outside the hospital. It was late, the streets were empty, and the world felt still. She tried to shake off the unease that had taken over her, but it clung to her like a second skin. As she walked toward her car, she heard it again, a whisper, soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help me. She froze. The voice wasn't coming from behind her. It wasn't coming from the hospital either. It was coming from the woods. She turned her head slowly, staring into the dark trees that lined the edge of the hospital grounds. The whisper grew louder, more desperate, and then, for the first time since that night, Lucy understood. The silent ward wasn't just a place in the hospital. It was a place that followed you, a place that bled into the world beyond the hospital's walls, a place where something dark and ancient waited forever. And Lucy knew then that she could never truly leave St. Gregory's, not while the shadows still followed, not while the whispers still called her name. Whatever had been awakened that night in the silent ward had followed her home, and it was never going to let her go. Is St. Gregory's just a hospital, or is it a doorway to something darker? The truth, perhaps, is lost in the shadows, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far. As for Nurse Lucy, she learned the hard way that some places are meant to remain undisturbed, and some stories are better left untold. But even as we close this chapter, one thing remains certain. The whispers never stop, and the darkness is always waiting.